Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the City Club of Portland. My name is Susan Hammer. I'm president of City Club, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here today. I'd like to give a special thanks today to Portland State University's Hatfield School of Government for assisting City Club in today's program. Please turn off your cell phones or anything else that beeps or rings or breaks into song. As you know, the Friday forums each week are the most visible part of what we do at City Club, but there is so much more going on, and I'd like to tell you just a little bit about things to expect. Well, next Friday, our forum will be on downtown Portland, the next iteration, and this will be part of our ongoing series on downtown Portland. John Carroll and Sandra McDonough, two key figures in the city, will join us to talk about the City of Portland. The program will be moderated by former City Club President Patty Tillich, who's also an architect. Next Monday, May 14th, our Agora program will be presenting a forum on the Big Look. And we will be joined by visionaries and leaders, Lake Oswego Mayor Judy Hammerstadt, Metro Councilor Brian Newman, and City of Portland Planning Director Gil Kelly. Space is limited. It's on May 14th at 5:30 at City Club Commons. Please call to RSVP. On Wednesday the 16th at 5:30, our program for Agora will host Jonathan Cohen, who will discuss his new book on healthcare entitled Sick, The Untold Story of Americans' Healthcare Crisis and the People Who Pay the Price. Dr. Bruce Goldberg, Director of Oregon Department of Human Services, will moderate the discussion. Again, please call City Club to RSVP. And then on Wednesday, May 23rd at 7 p.m., Agora documentary there will be an Agora program along with the New Leaders Council, and they're sponsoring a brief tour of New Columbia's Main Street, followed by a 30-minute film that was produced by two local filmmakers called Imagining Home, Stories of Columbia Villa. So that ought to be great, and I hope many of you can come. We have a number of new members today who I'd like to introduce. When you hear your name, please stand, and after you've all stood, let's welcome them with applause. Our first new member is Mike Wilson from Rose City Mortgage. Mike is a loan officer. Second is Emily Hill. Third, where is Emily? Back there. Welcome, Emily. Phil Richmond. Where's Phil? Right over here. Stephanie Roth from Renewable Energy. Where are you, Stephanie? Right over here. Welcome to City Club. Someone asked me recently, well, who can join City Club anyway? And the answer is you can. City Club is a very inclusive organization, and we would love to have everyone here today become a member. And this month we have a promotion, we have a special deal that I hope will make membership absolutely irresistible. If you join today, you will get a free lunch, compliments of our member and friend Al Jubitz. And those of you who sponsor someone or your name shows up on that little referred to line on the membership application, you also will get a free lunch. I also would like to say that this is an excellent gift for a graduate or for birthdays, so please do that. Now, to make this an even better deal, we do have a new member sign-up fee of $25, but today that will be waived. So please sign up today. We're not giving away toaster ovens, just giving the waiver of the membership fee. So I hope you will sign up today. We are so fortunate in Portland, Oregon, to have great corporate citizens that help make these programs possible, available to you and to our radio and television audience. Our sponsors this quarter are Schwabe, Williamson & Wyatt and KeyBank. Would you please join me in thanking our sponsors? Our program today is entitled The State of the World's Cities and What It Means for Portland. Back in 1970, our speaker, Tim Campbell, graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in political science and a master's degree in regional planning. He went on to earn his doctorate in urban studies and planning from MIT. For the past 30 years, Tim has focused on urban development around the globe, Latin America, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Africa. He spent 17 years at the World Bank, during which he headed the development teams, urban development teams, and yes, he is ready for your questions about the problems of Mr. Wolfowitz. Tim retired from the bank in 2005, and he's now chair of the Urban Age Institute, a nonprofit think tank that is seeking to solve global urban problems. Today, Tim brings us a unique perspective on the world's cities and mega regions, and a perspective on how Oregon competes and compares. On a personal note, some 30 years ago, Tim had the amazing foresight to buy a house in Berkeley, California, which he even kept over the years. So he will soon be our neighbor to the south, as he and his wife will be returning to Berkeley to make or remake their home here on the West Coast. Please welcome Tim Campbell.
Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Inspiring to see so many interested faces, not only in this topic, but also on things of interest to the city of Portland. And Susan and Bill, thank you so much. Thanks to the Portland City Club and also to George Beard at Portland State University for helping to arrange things. I know you all are interested in sustainability, in the future of Portland, in things urban, downtown renewal, getting those construction cranes out of the way and those tracks laid and able to enjoy things. And my remarks today are going to have only indirect reference to the kinds of renewal that you're seeing and living every day. My remarks have to do with how cities as corporate entities view themselves, view their role in the world, how that view has changed with globalization and other forces that are impinging on city leaders. Here's the program. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is that it's not just sustainability that's at issue with globalization. It's also that cities are on the rise. Cities are probably the only political economic unit on the planet that is increasing in power, while nation states, although of course much more powerful in absolute terms, are in relative decline. They can't control those transnational corporations anymore as they once used to in tax terms and in trade terms. Next, I'd like to talk about 9 things that you might not have known about cities in the developing world, and I hope to have some surprises anyway there. The main issue is about learning cities, and I think that this is the key thing for the next 50 years is how well or how badly cities can see their future, learn about themselves, acquire some coherence of action and of vision to be able to move forward and act as a whole. Because my feeling is, from the 30 years experience that I've had, is that cities have already started along this path and are well along the way. I'm going to give some case illustrations from the city of Bilbao in Spain, the city of Curitiba, perhaps you've heard of it, in Brazil, and your neighbor to the north, Seattle. And then talk a little bit about the opportunities that this might present for Portland. First, the 9 things. Here they are. It's not the numbers of people, it's the numbers of cities that people don't pay attention to, and I'll show you what I mean. That cities are growing flatter, not fatter, flatter. They're spreading out all around the world. They're more poor. Fourth, they have some interesting emerging health issues because of the way they're growing. Fifth, Asian cities are in total confusion, even though they're growing pell-mell, helter-skelter. You close your eyes one day and you see a high-rise the next. Lots of problems there. Portland has some answers for Asian cities. African cities are the fastest growing cities. Cities are the wealth of nations. Cities will drive the wealth of nations in the next 50 years, and this is an important feature to look at. All that means that city leaders are in strong cross currents, some pulling them back closer to participatory democracy, some pushing them out, saying get engaged in the global world. Very difficult role for mayors. And finally, for all of these reasons, cities are doing more learning. They're more interested in learning. What did I do with my watch? Oh, I got it. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So that's by way of preview. So I said it was the number of cities. Here's what I mean. By 2020, there are going to be 700 or 800 cities over 500,000 in population. 500 of them over 1 million in population around the globe. So we have 185 nations, but 500 cities that are plenty strong, that have plenty of capacity, that have plenty of appetite, and where all the economic activity takes place. So that's what I mean about it's the number of cities, not just population. Second, they're growing flatter. By this I mean that cities, like most cities in the United States, are growing at the fringe and in decreasing the densities, making all the sustainability issues that we talk about more difficult to achieve. A graphic would show you that the average densities of cities globally and in any region that you pick is going down. A picture of a city like Jaipur in India, up in Rajasthan, perhaps you know this place, would show a sort of a doubling in the size of its settlement pattern in just 10 years, between 1990 and the year 2000. And some people at NYU and at Princeton have data like this for Jaipur for 120 cities around the world, and it's completely consistent. It's just amazing. A third thing I said is that cities are growing poorer. And if you look at the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, the fraction of the poor living in cities has increased in every region of the world except for the rich parts of the world. So the urbanization that we talk about is also impoverishment of cities. So again, another strong challenge to city leaders. Some of these problems, the fact that cities are flatter, are poorer, and also are going to have an aging population, mean that new kinds of health issues will arise. Some of these are related to traffic accidents because cities are just not, particularly new and fast-growing cities, are not well organized to take care of traffic and to keep the burros and the oxen carts and the people and the badly lit vehicles out of the way of passengers, of pedestrians, and so to reduce accidents. Traffic accidents is one of the fastest growing health problems in the world, and it will only increase with the way cities are growing. Violence is another, person-to-person violence. I'm not talking about armed conflict in civil societies and wars and that, but domestic and civil violence one-on-one is on the rise as well. Obesity is another issue, because people who are poor cannot afford to stay thin. That's the sad truth. They can't get the nutrients in the amount of money they have to buy food to keep from getting fat. So obesity is one of the fastest growing health issues, and all of the sequelae of obesity in terms of heart disease and other things is out there. And then unsafe settlements is another problem. Just building houses that are of insubstantial materials in places where houses should not be built, in swamps and floodplains, near coasts that have a risk of tsunamis and that sort of thing. Number 5, I said that Africa is urbanizing fastest. Africa has a doubling rate of its urban population, the lowest of any major region in the world at 22 years. So you often don't think of Africa as an urban place, but in fact it is, and it's the most rapidly urbanizing region in the world. Asian cities are in confusion. This one I love because China and India are two of the giants that are promoting and propelling the rest of the world economy in the next 50 years. And their cities have, for very different reasons, have all kinds of interesting problems. I wrote a piece about this in the Urban Land Institute last October, if you want to refer to it. But basically, it talks about, you know, there's a couple of billion people on the planet living in those cities, 40% of them urban, and they lack the kinds of regulatory factors in society that we take for granted about governing land use, governing where you can settle, governing the power of mayors to do deals and to buy land from the rural poor and sell it to the rich developers from Hong Kong and Shanghai. The banks are shaky, and who do you call to solve these kinds of problems? And here I think this is one of the interesting challenges. Portland has some answers. Number 7, the wealth of nations depends on the health of cities. When somebody like Price Waterhouse comes out with a report on the cities and the future of the world, it tells you something. They're paying attention to this issue also. And Price Waterhouse identifies 7 forms of capital, none of them money, that cities have to pay attention to. And again, I see Portland as falling into this category with all of the talent and skills that have been attracted here. 8, on the cross-currents, all of these things mean that there are cross-currents working on city leaders. On the one hand, 70 or 80 countries around the world are decentralizing, I mean, like Russia, you know, they're giving power, decision-making and spending power to local governments. And the local governments are not really equipped for this. They want it badly, and they want their autonomy and to be able to express the needs and preferences of their local citizens, but also they don't have the capability to manage well to answer all the democratizing demands of participatory democracy. And at the same time, to earn their livings, city leaders are realizing that they also have to be global. They have to understand what's happening in the global economy to be able to create jobs and attract investment in their city. So I wouldn't want a job like that, to tell you the truth. In fact, I don't think it's doable, and maybe we should rethink the role of mayors. City managers, mayors is maybe an interesting proposition, but governance itself is a very difficult issue. And for all of these reasons, cities are engaged in learning. Early in my career in the World Bank, I began to organize city-to-city meetings. And boy, I'll tell you, those business cards were flying across the table just as fast as you could see them when mayors understood that that person over there has the same kind of difficulties and political challenges that I have. That person has some answers that I need. I have some answers that he or she needs, and like this. And so we began to organize these things almost on an annual basis. And I could see, began to do some research, that there's a sort of an underground economy of knowledge in city-to-city exchange. So what is a learning city? I'm about halfway through. Are we doing okay? Okay. What is a learning city? I look at cities as learning organizations, and even some of them are smart. So I've called them smart cities, and I'm going to talk a little bit about smart cities and what they are. But here's the preview. So learning cities and smart cities create a system of learning. They pay attention to what they're learning and how they learn. They create an agency or a practice or a culture of learning, and they invest in it. And I'll explain what I mean. They're proactive. They go out and seek information and innovation and new practices and bring it back and instruct their core about what is at stake and how solutions were arrived in other places. They store that information in different ways and make it accessible to future generations of planners. This thing goes on in some of the cities that I'm talking about, 25 years. Portland is like that, okay? You don't know it yet, I don't think. You don't have that core organized yet, but I think there's a lot of talent in this city. A lot of people want to live here, people who believe in the city. And so I think that you might want to pay some attention to this idea of learning cities. And cities learn the most from each other for reasons I described with the mayors of the conferences that we organize. So now I'm going to move very quickly because there are 3 kind of detailed cases that I'd like to talk about. One is about Bilbao in the northwestern part of Spain. Bilbao is famous for the Guggenheim Museum. Perhaps you've been there. It's a fantastic building, absolutely wonderful. And the people in Bilbao realized that in 1980, when the European Union was being formed, they couldn't survive on their shipping and their steel and their glass any longer, and they were going to have to make a change. And everyone understood this. And so they all sat in rooms like this to figure out what they were going to become. And over a long period of time, it took them 7 years to get to a point where they decided they were going to be a city of learning, education, and culture, which meant tourism also. And they were going to make their living in a different way. And they had to make a wholesale transformation in what their city looked like and how it functioned. And so Bilbao formed a group called Metropoli 30. Okay, it doesn't mean anything to you, but basically that's the learning agency. That's the repository of knowledge. That's the proactive group that goes out and learns things. They identified 8 or 9 different projects up and down the river that bisects the city. And one of the things they needed to do is move the port out of the center of the city with all the old cranes and, ugly steel structures and all of that stuff. And they completely moved out the port from the center and moved it to the exterior part of the where the river meets the sea. And then they began to think about, well, we got to do the metro system. Let's see if we can get an anchor institution like a big old fancy, well-designed building like the Guggenheim. Let's make plans for 2010. Let's put in a new airport. All of these things they did. And you go now today and you see the Guggenheim Museum that's pictured in one of these slides. And you realize how fantastically well they thought through this process. And the Guggenheim is the result, not the cause, of the renovation and the renewal in Bilbao. It came 10 or 15 years after all of this began. So it's a very interesting experience. There are lots of convention centers and museums and beautiful buildings like the Santiago Calatrava Bridge that crosses the river in the center of town, begins to attract artifacts, art, culture, and architecture and design. The metro system is quite thorough. The new park where the old shipping and steelmaking used to be is a splendid esplanade now. And that one of the things that bears remarking is that I did a count, between 1990 and 2005, Bilbao organized 40 international seminars on city growth, regional growth, urban renewal, sustainability, financing cities, all of that stuff, with the same constituency in the room each time, trying to get the same people so they were on the same page, so they understood what world cities were doing and what the challenge was before them. And next year, they'll have the European Institute for City Development. So they've turned themselves into we did it, now we're going to show you how we did it. Another way of learning is to send out emissaries. And this is what Seattle does with this Trade Development Alliance in the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. Bill Stafford there organizes every year at least one mission that goes with 100 business and civic leaders to another city in the world. Some of them are in the developing world. Some of them are in China. Many of them are in Europe. And sometimes they're now bringing in delegations from other cities. For instance, in Bogota has called up, said, we'd like to know what you're up to. The important thing is all of the elected leadership, the major institutions of health and learning, the university, the hospitals, the cancer center, Boeing, Microsoft, Starbucks, send people on these missions. And what happens? You go for 10 days. I went with them as a part of my training in the World Bank to Shanghai, and I went also to part of the Milan meeting, and to learn how they learned. I wanted to see what was the dynamic there, and it's really astounding because the people go, they hear a presentation sometimes from Americans in Shanghai or Chinese who are fluent in English, and they tell them about the legal process and the health process and how you finance this and how we did that. And of course, some of it doesn't have applicability to Seattle. Seattle was taken to an area called Pudong in Shanghai, which is across the river from the old Shanghai, from the old Bund, if you know Shanghai at all. And Pudong is the size of Seattle, and it was built in 11 years. Okay. Meanwhile, Seattle is debating for 15 years the third runway at SeaTac Airport. And, all the Seattle people are sort of looking at their shoes a little bit embarrassed, how these guys did this and how they financed it. And, of course, it's a very different game. But when these 100 businesses and civic leaders have meals together or on their buses, they're chatting about this. They're talking. They're bonding. They're understanding. I talked with a VP from Boeing. I said, why do you send your 3 best and brightest people on this study tour? these are 25-year-olds. He says, this is the best training I can buy for my people. No other training program that I know about is as good as these city tours. So that's why I do it. And so they bond. And when they get back to Seattle and somebody from Boeing needs to call about constructing their 777 to figure out from City Hall whether they're going to get the off-ramp from the freeway, oh yeah, you were on the study tour to Shanghai, I remember you. And they've made the connection already. Because, you put a face on the other end of the phone. So this bonding, this benchmarking, they benchmark themselves against other cities. They went to Barcelona and saw Barcelona. Barcelona is a fabulous city. It's something you must see one day. It has completely, I think it's reinvented itself 4 times in the last 30 years because of the Olympics and for other reasons, the independence from the central government, for instance. And Barcelona has figured out a way to bring all of the left, the right, the organized, the disorganized, the church, the business segments, the unions, around a table to decide how they're going to make their next decisions, that is to say, the next major investments in Barcelona. What do we do now? And if you look at the Barcelona case, you'll see major works all across the city, all done in a very integrated fashion. And that taught Seattle, we don't have our arms around this whole process. Nobody in the civic community has control over all of Seattle that needs to be controlled for us to attract investment into Seattle. And it gave them pause. And so they organized a retreat. They went up to Vancouver, BC. They got out of the United States and said, let's talk about this. How are we going to solve this problem? Now, they've been doing this for 10 years, so these people know each other very well, and they set up an agency, local economic development agency, regional development agency that looks at all of Cascadia that will carry them forward in their learning process and planning. So, Sydney, Singapore, Shanghai, Barcelona, London, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Amsterdam, they went to a lot of places. I've already talked a little bit about Shanghai and Barcelona. So the third case is Curitiba. This is a city in Brazil famous for its transit system, famous for its greenways, famous for the per capita kilometrage in parks, famous for garbage that's not garbage. A lot of very interesting things, very innovative things that Curitiba figured out a way to do. And when I began researching Curitiba, I know Brazil very well. I've traveled to more than 40 cities in Curitiba and spent in Brazil and spent a lot of time there. I found that behind all of these was an organization, an Institute for Urban Research and Planning. It's called IPUC, is the acronym in Portuguese. But this was the Metrópole 30, or the Trade Development Alliance for Curitiba. This was the place that, and more than even in Bilbao and in Seattle, holds all the data. They have more data. It's like, who are our clients? Who are our customers? They treat themselves like, we're serving the people. That's what our data is for. That's why we do it. And you want to open a new route for a garbage truck, or a transfer station, they know exactly who's living there, what the income level is, whether you can get in, whether the widths are wide enough, and if they're not wide enough, they have programs, to bring the poor can exchange bags of recycled garbage already into the transfer depots in exchange for food for the poor. I mean, but of course, the big thing that Curitiba did was in creating a way to defeat the automobile. And that was their starting point. In 1966, Jaime Lerner, who was the upcoming mayor of Curitiba and then director of IPUC, said, we need to get control of the car. The central government is giving us all kinds of money to build freeways, but this guy saw way back then that wasn't the way to go. I noticed you guys also cut off some freeways here too, and so did San Francisco and other places, but these people were, by Latin American standards, way ahead of everybody else. And so they created a place in one block, said no cars here. They created a pedestrian mall. It's called Flower Street. You can go there today. It looks beautiful, very leafy, lots of flowers for sale, little red carts, moving about for ambulatory salespeople who operated in the informal sector. And then they extended it to whole blocks. And then they extended their transit system all throughout the city. And then you could see that the zoning was conformed perfectly to what they wanted. Very high density around all the radials, that were driving these linked buses. They have a very sophisticated system of turnabouts for buses in, they're like a metro on the surface on rubber tires. That's really what it is. And one of the great innovations, I mean, there are 10 or 15 innovations that makes this metro system run. One of them is to build transit stations. Listen, these guys invented this themselves. They said, okay, we'll make little tubes that people can find shelter in. You go up the stairs, you buy your ticket there, okay? You go to this designated X, so that when the bus pulls up next to this tube, just adjacent to it, you get on in the back and off in the front, and the transaction time is cut by like 70%. So in and off really fast. Not down old stairs, not difficult for ladies with carriages, you know, older folks. Very, very clever thing, okay? And that system has been brought to New York City to show New York how they did it in Curitiba, and now it's moved to Bogota, it's moved to Mexico City. I know people from Shanghai and Ho Chi Minh City who are looking at this. But Ipuki was behind some of this design. Okay? They don't take credit for everything, and it would be wrong to think that, oh, Ipuki is the secret, the solution. But it was there. It did the analytical work. It had the data. It could bring this to play for city managers and transportation engineers as they began to think about what they wanted to do in the future. They have something like 53 hectares per person in parks. They're going to compete with Portland on that one, okay? I mean, they have it for special reasons, but you guys can be proud too. I haven't done the calculations yet. You may have more. So in summary, the lessons from the learning cities. Each of the cities that I've talked about now had some sort of felt need. Bilbao is the strongest one. The EU's coming. Our economy is toast, okay? So, in Curitiba, it was the automobile. In Seattle, it was how do we benchmark ourselves, how do we move forward. They all thought long term, and they're strategic. Okay? This wasn't doing plans inside the city. This is thinking big. This is like, we call it visioning sometimes. It's like that. Okay? Where do we want to be in 2025? You know, how are we going to carry forward? They created an agency of some kind, a tissue of organization that could be responsible for the information, the data, and to be able to talk to themselves and to citizens and so on. They were proactive and very participatory, all of them. Brought in people from all walks of life to talk. Particularly in the case of Seattle, they were outbound. They went out there and found the best lessons and benchmarked themselves, came back and could see what they should do. And they all invest in knowledge and their capacity building. So in the first part of my talk where I talked about these 10 things or 9 things you might not have known, the things that came out, let's see if any of these resonate in the room about Portland. Participatory planning, the global search for comparative advantage, how are we going to make our living? Land use, hello, Portland, planning, regulatory controls, job creation and growth, traffic controls, light rail, obesity, violence, unsafe settlements. It's a regulatory issue or issues. Engaging in learning exchange mechanisms and in governance issues, and particularly metropolitan governance issues, which I think is another area where Portland might have something to say. So the questions then for you all and for the city of Portland, in my mind, are, to ask yourselves in this kind of thinking, what brings talent to Portland? Why is it special? And then, what does Portland do well? Investing in collective knowledge that can be available to anyone. How much does the city invest in its knowledge about itself? How well integrated is a group like this, or the governance board, or any of the city or tri-county organizations integrated with each other, and the private sector, and the commercial establishments, the minority groups, and so on. And then how well does Portland trade on its experience? I think there's just a lot of possibilities there to show the rest of the world how Portland solved its problems, and a lot of possibilities to acquire a coherence of effort and of understanding in Portland for its own future. Thanks very much for listening. Happy to take questions.
Time for questions. Questions can be asked by City Club members. Please keep them brief so as to allow time for more people. Our first question will be asked by board host Bill Kramer. Bill is treasurer of the Board of Governors of City Club. He's a healthcare consultant. He serves on the board of the International Sustainable Development Foundation. Bill earned his MBA from Stanford's Graduate School of Business and his bachelor's degree from Harvard. Bill.
Thanks, Susan. And thank you, Tim, for your very informative and provocative presentation. I was struck by your concept of learning cities and the importance of acquiring knowledge and intelligence and a sense of identity. I was reminded of a speech given many years ago on a similar topic. In 1938, Lewis Mumford, the great American urban thinker and writer, gave a speech here to the City Club of Portland in which he said, quote, "I have seen a lot of scenery in my life, but I have seen nothing so tempting as a home for man as this Oregon country. You have here a basis for civilization on its highest scale. I'm going to ask you a question which you may not like. Are you good enough to have this country in your possession? Have you got enough intelligence, imagination, and cooperation among you to make the best use of these opportunities?" My question is, how are we doing? What are the greatest strengths that Portland can build upon, and what are some of the most serious obstacles that we might face? Is it a lack of a major world-class university? Is it a sense of complacency or self-satisfaction? Or the struggles to compete in a global economy? Or any other obstacles and strengths you might comment on? Thanks.
Well, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. I'm not the person to answer this question, but I am happy to offer kind of indirect reflections of what I see, and don't pretend any authoritativeness in any of this at all. But as an outsider and a friendly one from the West Coast who's been through Portland many times as a college student and before, my parents used to always go to the Shakespeare Festival. In fact, I have aunts and uncles here. The natural environment, for starters, is a tremendous asset. So then it leads to outdoors, it leads to equipment, it leads to equipment design, it leads to, and that requires special kinds of talent. The talent probably in all of that design and management wasn't created here, it was imported. And the question about, those are global markets, okay, and global inputs coming in from Vietnam and China, the designs finally made real. So if I were to think about it, and sort of one of the most effective techniques I learned at MIT was not to do the calculations, but to squint at the board, and to see what pattern I get out of the squinting. And if I were to squint at this, I would say it's not really creating a world-class university here. That's a gigantic, Herculean effort. You have great universities already in the state and in the city. A university for the city, for city knowledge, Portland State. So, and you're already attracting talent from without. By that I mean from other countries. If you look at one of the most recent books on regional development, Annalise Saxenian's book called The New Argonauts, she talks about how Silicon Valley grew rich and how it exported the wealth from Indians and Israelis and Chinese, who settled for a little while in Silicon Valley and then took the knowledge that they had acquired back to their home countries and figured out ways to make it work in their home countries, and then came back and traded with Silicon Valley, so it enriched the place where they started. I think that's a kind of a pattern that would work here as well, because people love to live here. You have the natural environment, and it's going to attract talent. Attracting talent is a key thing. So I would say that is a kind of a partial answer to your question.
Thank you. My name is Lawrence Wolf. I'm a professor of engineering, member of the City Club. And I want to ask you about slums. I've been reading lately that the the largest population growths in the world today are in slums. And this being the case, and also that these slums are in fact very stable economic communities. And I wonder if you would comment on this a bit.
Sure. Slums are, generally speaking, human settlements made up of populations that don't have title to land. Often they've squatted there. You find slums now that have been, 4 generations. They're very consolidated. Universally poor, extremely poor. And you find places in Mumbai, for instance, the Dharavi slum that has 80,000 people in it, is an incredible hotbed of small-scale informal sector industry. Leather belts and tea kettles and handles of this and for shopping bags and all kinds of small things you wouldn't think of, but people make a living there. Okay. But it's an unusual case. The people who live in slums have very few opportunities. Unemployment or underemployment rates are quite high, 30, 40, 50, 60%. Some places in Rio, I've done a long-term study from 69 to 99 of some slums in Rio de Janeiro that used to be hopeful and had a vision for their own future. By God, I only was third grade education, but my kids are going to get through high school and they're going to get out of this. Interviewed in 1969. Interviewed in 1999, the grandchild graduated from high school but can't find a job, is locked inside the slum because they can't get out. No one wants to buy there. They can't even sell their property. They're living in large compounds. They're not politically active anymore, and they've lost hope. It's very sad. Plus, drugs and guns have come in upon them like rain, and it's just awful. I mean, the data that we had was something like 1 out of every 5 families knows someone who was shot or a family member who was killed. I mean, those are almost wartime conditions. And so not all slums are, people want their dignity wherever they are. They just want to make a living. If they have an opportunity, they'll go for it for the most part. But lots of times the conditions are so adverse to them. I don't see easy solutions out of this. And I think we have a long, long way to go. The first thing, of course, we can do is try to do something about healthcare, try to do something about education, try to do something about the conditions of life. Water in, clean water in, dirty water out. Simple as that. And if we get there in the next 50 years, I think, and this is from someone, I spent a lot of time walking around in slums, heard a lot of gunshots, heard a lot of terrible stories. I'm not very optimistic about it, but I think it's one of the most pressing problems we have on the planet. So I'm glad you raised the question.
Mike Roach, City Club member and board member of the Sustainable Business Network of Portland. On a brighter note, Portland is blessed with a critical mass of locally owned small businesses as diverse as Powell's Books and Voodoo Donuts. I'd like to ask you...
I haven't seen Voodoo's Donuts yet.
Oh, you're in for a treat then, a sweet treat. I'd like to ask you, what role, if any, do you think that small locally owned businesses play in attracting talent to a city? And if there is a role, how would you recommend that local government and the private sector encourage and nurture those kinds of businesses?
Yeah, another very good question. I don't have a lot to say on this. I'm not an economic development strategist. I don't know small business as well. My game is cities and the bigger thing about cities. I think it's an excellent question. I think it's a question of creating the right environment, having connections with the larger business community, understanding that most of the jobs are in small businesses. So I think you're on the right page there from what I know, but I'm afraid I can't give you much more than that.
Thank you very much.
Justin Gottlieb, City Club member. My question is, you alluded to that cities are getting flatter as they're getting larger, and from my studies, there's a term called megalopolis. Are we on the forefront of maybe an entirely new conception of what a city is that maybe doesn't have regional borders or city borders or state borders?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent question. Again, it's a little bit like the story about Seattle. We can't get our arms around it. It's not just the city, it's the counties and even up in Canada and down here. I mean, it's a region that interacts with itself and is seen as a region from afar. A metropolis is a city with a megacity is a city with 10 million or more by most definitions. Okay, megalopolises are when those things start joining together. You know, Boston, Washington, New York, and of course it creates all kinds of headaches on the political governance side. How do you represent the interest? What is the common interest? How is that articulated? How do you do a budget that will satisfy, you know, groups like that? Those are very tricky questions. I can tell you the World Bank, I mean, I'm an urban guy, I've been in the World Bank for 17 years and worked for them for 10 years before that as a consultant, and nobody there has answered that question, okay? And they pay attention to these issues. I think it's not that we're on the verge of a new thing, it's already here. But the governance issues, I think, as you were rightly pointing out, are very real and something that needs a lot of attention. Academics need to turn to that, businesses need to turn to that. I think it needs a lot of attention.
Hi, Mike Poland, City Club member. My question is about leadership structures of cities. I was wondering if you've seen any lessons in your studies of cities between those that have a strong mayor and city manager versus those where power is more diffused among a city council.
This is where I duck, right? Well, let me say this. I won't address the strong mayor, weak mayor thing, but there's no doubt, we did a study of 25 innovations at the subnational level, meaning, you know, cities and states in Latin America, after the wave of decentralization that shifted power and money to localities in the 90s. And the one thing that we noticed was a blossoming of local leaders who felt empowered, had the money to do things, wanted to try new innovations, and they sprung out there like daisies in springtime. And so they didn't always work, they didn't always last. Some of them did, the ones that did we wrote up in this book. It's called Innovations, my own book, I don't remember the title. But it looks at a number of cases, and in every case, there's a leader and a champion there who sticks with it, okay? Whether it's a strong mayor or whoever it is, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce, you know, somebody's got to raise the flag and say, by God, we should go this way. Look at how good this is, and let's get organized around this. This is the coherence of effort that I was talking about earlier. So leadership is very important, not only or not necessarily elected leadership. Pretty good duck, don't you think?
Joe Sixta, I'm a student at Portland State University and a City Club member. My question is, are larger metropolitan regions better at combating poverty and dealing with smarter growth and more sustainable cities, or should we be working on more distributed urban areas that are between 50,000 and 1 million in population throughout the space of the state?
Okay, two parts of that question in my view. One is there, I think behind your question, is there an optimal city size, you know, for doing good and for solving these problems? And you know, I've looked at this question a long, long time, and the answer is no. There's not an optimal city size. What really counts, I mean, there may be upper limits where it gets really difficult, like in the previous questioner, meaning in the megalopoli and stuff like that. But what really counts is listening to people, you know. Municipal government, metropolitan governments are creatures of the state. They're there to serve the interests of the citizens, and they have to find ways so the citizen preferences and interests are articulated clearly, and the interests and the citizens have to step up to the plate and say what we want. Okay, so that's how the system works in a decentralized democracy. So when it works that way, at least you get the message up there how you want the budget distributed. You know, whether you want it for healthcare, or whether you want education, or more parks, or whatever. By the way, there's a very interesting case in the city of Porto Alegre in Brazil. They have a thing called participatory budget, where the capital budget is negotiated in large meetings, larger than this, with citizens in a repetitive cycle, so that the investments are made where citizens really want them, instead of in backroom deals. They don't do the whole budget that way, and they don't do a recurrent budget that way, but they do a significant fraction of the capital budget. Very interesting outcomes. Another thing that's spreading throughout Latin America.
Ralph Crawshaw, City Club. And your discussion about the groups that go to other cities and the enthusiasm and the bonding that occurs there, the human nature generally has a balance, and that is there must have been naysayers as well. And when they came home, I'm assured there were naysayers Would you squint at the numbers on the board and give us your impression of how the naysayers operate and what to do about them?
Yes, I will. I think that the way to address your question, an excellent question, is for academics, perhaps at Portland State or other places, business schools, to look at the failures. You know, I've talked about successes, and in the successes that I talked about, there were failures, and I didn't feature them. And one of the reasons for not featuring them is that when you look only at a failure, maybe you learn some lessons, but does that get you to success? You only know that that thing didn't work. By looking at successes, at least you know something that worked. And yes, you also have to look at some of the failures, some of the problems that were overcome, the false starts, the falling in the ruts, the naysayers, and that sort of thing. But I think it's not that I can, my squinting doesn't come up with any number that says there were more failures than successes, if that's what you were asking. But I'm sure that there's difficulties along the way, and that one of the challenges for us is to understand how those difficulties are overcome. Part of it is in negotiation, for instance, in figuring out how to bring two sides together. That's a skill that most city leaders do not have. I mean, even though they're politicians, you know, when it comes down in a council meeting, whether it's budget going to be spent this way or that way, if you're not in Porto Alegre, then, or trading off the interest and the demands of angry constituents, you know, that takes a very special skill. Again, you know, I don't want to be a mayor, you know, that's too tough a job.
Lezak, City Club member. You've talked about growing populations, but not about population control. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, in the big picture, and this is not squinting, but it's looking out like this, you know, and you're looking back 30 years. I remember doing my postdoc in Mexico City, all the best numbers showed that Mexico City was going to be 35 million by the turn of the century, by the year 2000. It never got there. Okay, and you know, this doesn't make the headlines. Mexico City is under 22 million. Okay, why? What happened there? And that pattern is repeated in many places. The biggest cities, despite the question asked by our friend 4 persons back, are growing slower than the middle-sized cities. Almost everywhere you look. They're in the less than 2%, whereas the 100,000 to 500,000 size cities are growing around 4%. So, okay, that doesn't sound like 2%, 4%, but it makes a big difference over 25 years. Okay, so, and why is that? It's because there are natural limits in large cities. Prices go up, congestion, I can't get around, I can't find parking, forget it, you know. There's kind of a spontaneous descent. Mexico City did this, it's a perfect case study, decentralized itself by all the millions of choices that individuals made. No government policy was involved. Okay, so, and one of the factors at work in the reduction of birth rates in large cities is that females have more opportunities. They tend to have more education. They tend to get jobs. They tend to postpone childbearing years. And that has a tremendous effect on the birth rate. So that's connecting your question to cities itself. Okay, and the larger thing about the world, you know, what are we now? Going to 8 in 2020, 8 billion, right? No, I've seen numbers written by ecologists to say we can go to 40 billion, no problem. Of course, we have, that was before the greenhouse gases. But generally speaking, urbanization dampens down birth rates. So in some ways, it's like, I think you asked me, or maybe it was Rich from the Oregonian, asked me about the future. You know, aren't cities all the problems that we have? And I said, yes, but they're also the solutions that we have. That's where the solutions are invented. And I think that that's at the heart of the matter in today's session.
Hi, Barb Wolf, City Club member. One problem that we must face here in Portland, and actually is being faced around our country, is the homelessness In your experience, have you found anyone who has dealt well with that and has any solutions?
Yes, good question. All of these are really excellent questions. The answer is no. And I don't know the United States well. I'm not someone who pays a lot of attention to U.S. cities. I learn from them when I can. Seattle's a perfect case. I'm loving Portland, okay? But my experience is in cities in the developing world, and the homelessness issues there take a completely different form. You know, it just inverts the whole proposition. Most people are homeless in a way, and they squat somewhere. Okay? They make do. They live on the sidewalks. They live under lean-tos and blankets and stuff. The solutions, I think, though, are bigger than anybody has imagined. I mean, it depends on whether the society is ready to make a commitment that every individual in the society should have access to decent shelter. And if that's political position, I agree, if that political position is adopted, then it's a question of figuring out, it's not just helping the homeless, it's not just helping the low-income strata, it's revising the entire system, okay, so that long-term mortgages are available to people who have very small incomes, so that the finance, in Latin America, there's no mortgage system. There's no long-term mortgage system. There's just no chance for anybody on small incomes to afford long-term shelter, to get a mortgage. And now that's beginning to change with microfinance. Mohammed Yusuf, with the Grameen Bank and all of the spin-offs of that in microfinance is beginning to make a dent there. I noticed Gates gave some money just recently to microfinance with credit cards for the poor, okay, for specific purposes that are encoded in the card. And so these kinds of things will help, but they're system-wide solutions. It's not just fix it here, fix it there on this block or that block or this segment or that segment. So it's a big deal.
Kurt Wavering, member, you described that the poor are being attracted to the city, as they have been for hundreds of years, and it generally has been a positive long-term benefit, more income, more choice, more education. In your work, what kinds of, let me put it positively, what signs of hope do you see in terms of inventions or developments for this process to helping the poor that are coming into the city?
The big answer, I think, is you're moving human capital to places where it can be productive. Okay, that brings with it a lot of issues that we have in the United States today about immigration. Okay, but if you think it through, all of the places that I've talked about that are poor, the migrants who have come in, or the talent that comes in, the talent that went to Silicon Valley, there were Indians and Israelis and Chinese and so on, are all migrants. Okay, they're human beings with smarts. Okay, or at least. And what we always say about migrants, even if it's between one city and another in Mexico or Brazil or Zambia or Ho Chi Minh or Vietnam, they're moving to a place where they see opportunity. Opportunities that can't be seen by a bureaucrat somewhere or economic development specialist. And so the people, I think, that are most enlightened on this issue see migration as a way to improve the lives of everybody because they're finding their most productive place on the planet. So it's something along those lines.
Carol Witherell, City Club member. Every city confronts issues of climate change, social, economic inequality, and conflict over energy, resources, and use. And those are issues of sustainable security as well as development. How might cities around the world cooperate to offer a vision and enact a future of more mutuality in meeting these needs than the control and dominance tactics of many states, many nations rather, today, including our own?
Yeah, another good question. So the most practical example, I think, of an answer to your question is the group called ICLEI, which was an Institute for Sustainability between and among cities. They have something like 800 members now. They meet every year. It's a perfect example of the city-to-city exchange that I was talking about earlier. I went to one of their meetings in Cape Town last year. I was stunned at the quality of analytic speech meaning, talk and arguments and concepts. And the amount of, and the level of energy and the amount of experiments that were going on all around the world that were being presented there for anybody who wanted to listen. Commitments being made between European cities. Europe has gone big time on this Agenda 21, which is basically an outline of sustainability for cities. Okay, it was started by a Canadian named Jeff Brugman, who once worked down in Santa Monica, California, discovered that with small changes in the way the operating procedures for the electric generators in Santa Monica could cut their greenhouse gases by 30% or 40% or something like that. It was his start, and he thought, gee, all the cities could do this. We could make a big difference. This was back in the early 70s. So there are lots of international organizations and confederations, mostly associational type, like Metropolis, like the Union of Local Cities and Cities and Local Governments, and ICLEI, who do this kind of thing. And I think that's where the answer is on the sustainability issues.
I'm sorry to say that we are out of time. Please join me in thanking Tim Campbell for a very interesting presentation. And on behalf of the City Club of Portland, I'd like to thank you all for being here today, and again invite you to join if you're not already a member. I'd like to thank our radio and television audience for your interest in City Club. We are adjourned.